Hi everyone, Phoenix or Nix here, and welcome to another video. And an interesting gaming news update. Sony is planning on selling its Square Enix stocks, and they have about 9.5 million stock shares within Square Enix. And that's quite a lot. That makes them the third largest shareholder in Square Enix, which is really shocking to hear that they're sort of selling all of that off, and it could net them a profit of about $147 million. And it got me thinking, why would they do this? Because there's a lot of different reasons why I could see them doing it. As those who keep up with the gaming news, in the past couple of years, Sony hasn't exactly had the best of times when it comes to profit and money making. They've sold off many different divisions, like their television division, and etc. etc. And slowly they've chipped away at their different divisions until really their gaming division is pretty much the only big one they have left, the big money maker for them. Of course, when you look at I'm not saying that nobody else has suffered in the gaming industry. Of course, everyone has. You know, Microsoft with the Xbox and Nintendo with the Wii and all the different publishers. But when you look at Nintendo are still hanging in there pretty strong, and considering they're one of the oldest console manufacturers and game publishers, I can see them lasting a lot longer than Sony ever would. And then you look at Microsoft, and Microsoft's fine because Microsoft has its computer division, its software areas. Even if gaming went off the cliff tomorrow, they wouldn't really have to worry too much because they have a lot of other money-making divisions, so they're pretty set in their ways. But it's really weird to hear that Sony is now selling off all of these stocks, and it's sort of it just got me wondering why they would do that. Because as I said, they've not had the best couple of years. Nobody has in the game industry, but Sony themselves have probably been one of the ones that hit the hardest, especially when you look at also the fact they had the security breach only what was it, a couple of years ago, and all of these different things that have been affecting them. And it sort of made me wonder, are they having financial troubles once again? Do they need to sell off these stocks because they're losing money still? I can imagine that they're losing money at the moment on the PlayStation 4 because, as I'm sure some of us know, that when you launch a console, you're going to lose money anyway. You're going to lose money for a couple of years before you start making profit on the console. And at the end of the day, it's the software that makes you the money. And from what I've seen, of course, I'm not very invested in the Xbox One or the PlayStation 4, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of titles out there at the moment. So they can't be making, I'm sure they're making a decent amount of money, but maybe not enough to make a profit, perhaps. Other than that, I guess they could be doing it. The other side of the coin is, we flip it over, is that they're just selling it off because now that Square Enix has stopped doing certain deals with them, for instance, they had a somewhat console exclusive with a couple of games with Square Enix, and I'm just wondering, maybe is that why? Because they sort of broke that console exclusion when it came to Final Fantasy 13, because at first I think it was thought that it would just be on PlayStation, because as we know, through the years, Final Fantasy has only come out on the PlayStation until Final Fantasy 13, where they broke the mold and it came out on Xbox 360 as well. So I'm just wondering, maybe is it because that Square Enix have now branched out more and are starting to develop for all of the other consoles on the market? Is that why Sony feels that a little bit of trust has been broken, perhaps? And then the other side of the coin, yes, this is a three-sided coin, is the fact that Sony is disappointed in Square Enix's sort of current games, what their latest games have been like. And I can imagine that might be one of the stronger reasons being so, because if you look at a couple of the Square Enix games that have come out, Square Enix not only likes to jump the gun when it comes to sales, predicted sales, where if we look at Tomb Raider and Sleeping Dogs and Hitman, because I'm pretty sure they projected sales that were ludicrous for those series, and I can imagine that might irritate Sony, being a shareholder and probably investing quite a bit of cash into Square Enix, that they're irritated that those projected sales never met their targets. And I can imagine that really could irritate Sony, considering, how much money we're giving these guys, and they projected those sales and they came out with those. Right, because I can imagine, again, going back to the whole fact that Sony isn't making as much money at the moment, they're not doing too well. Maybe they don't want to sacrifice the money they're investing into Square Enix, because Square Enix isn't exactly pumping out a lot of good content. And I'm afraid to say it, but Final Fantasy 13 and 13-2, being one of the biggest franchises for Square Enix, and the budget those games must have had, especially Final Fantasy 13 with a 5-year development run, the amount of money they must have sunk into that. And then what came out of it at the end was a half-assed, disappointing Final Fantasy. It's still one of my favourites, still one of my favourite Final Fantasies, it's still up there, but it was still a very disappointing Final Fantasy game. It definitely wasn't at the same calibre as the others. So I can imagine that seeing Final Fantasy 13, not only did they break the exclusion with Sony, but they also didn't exactly produce that great a game, especially for their best and most solid solid franchise, and that's what came out. Probably Sony was just like, whoa. And then we look at the other games that, again, the really over the top predicted sales that Square Enix seems to boast, which never come to fruition. I can imagine that might be one of the reasons. But just an interesting piece of news I thought I'd share with you all, and I'd like to hear what your opinions might be on it. Does this mean that Sony is having financial trouble once again? Is one of the biggest gaming giants slowly beginning to lose their foothold in the gaming industry, perhaps? You know, it could happen. Gaming is slowly, it seems like gaming is slowly becoming less and less of a big industry. And I think one of the problems is these ridiculous budgets that they put on these video games. They're even bigger budgets than movies now, and I think it's ludicrous, because the games they pump out with these big budgets are absolute crap. And then you look at the games, well, many years down the line, we look all the way back to Oblivion. Oblivion had a team of, I don't know, it had a smaller team than what Skyrim had, and they probably had a less budget, and Oblivion still would whoop Skyrim's arse any day of the week, and Skyrim had a bigger budget and a bigger team. So it's just sort of a bit of a head scratcher. You've got more money, you've got a bigger team, and yet you're developing a crappier game. And that's what seems to be happening with all these different games nowadays. I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions, there are definitely exceptions, but most of the games nowadays have these ridiculous budgets, and it just seems like the developers get a little bit greedy with their money, and they just, I mean, I would wonder how much really goes into the budget, but they waste away this budget on what, probably good-looking graphics and good-looking cutscenes, and Square Enix is definitely a culprit of this, because if we look at Final Fantasy 13 and its beautiful graphics, which Square Enix believe, it seems like they believe that graphics come first, that's what's going to sell the game. No, it's not, Square Enix, but you seem to most definitely put most of your budget on the goddamn cutscenes that shouldn't really take up a lot of your time. But if you look at Final Fantasy 13, a good 50% of that game is cutscenes, and it's just incredible that just how all of these games have flared up to this sort of movie status, like these AAA movies, you know, given these giant budgets, and then they throw out this piece of crap at the end, and then they charge you £40 for it, or $60 in America. I think what they need to do is they need to lower these budgets, they need to lower the price of video games, and they need to step back and have a look at themselves, because they all seem to be getting in a rut, especially Sony. And I remember listening to the 8-Bit podcast, if you ever listened to that, it's a great podcast about gaming, but they were discussing Sony's losses, and their losses were absolutely incredible, outrageous losses, and if they're still losing money right now, it's sort of wondering how long are they going to continue being in the game industry, because considering that that's the biggest industry for them, that's their biggest division, their gaming division, and they're losing money hand over foot. It's just like, well, how long are they going to remain? How long are they going to be able to stay as one of the big contenders? Like I said, though, Microsoft could probably walk out any time and really not care less. But what I like is that Microsoft now has a new, completely different piece of news, but Microsoft now has a new director. I think it's a director or a VP, and it sounds like he's definitely taking the right route when it comes to Xbox. So hopefully we'll be seeing a lot better content from Xbox now, and hopefully they'll change their ways. But thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please tell me what you think about what I've been discussing in this video. It certainly is a very interesting move by Sony, and there could be a lot of different variables why they did it. But it's looking like they need money to me, because that's a lot of shares to be selling off. That's a lot of money to be made. But considering Square Enix is one of probably the most notable gaming publishers, why would they now take away that foothold within Square Enix? It's quite interesting. So please tell me what you think. Please comment. I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.